Okay, Rachaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, towards the bottom, and we continue with our halachas of Chanukah. So we discussed the placement of the menorah. We discussed the manner in which a person should light the menorah, namely the halacha of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then we discussed the story of Chanukah. What's the essence of the miracle? We at least got a flavor for the amount of questions that revolve around that story and the amount of different ways of looking at it. We suggested one reading in Rashi. Of course, there are many others within Rashi, and then there are other versions that are not like Rashi in the morning. 21b, and then we're 22a. And then we discussed, so now we're going to discuss considering the location of the menorah. As we talked about before, that it should be outside. Nowadays we do it indoors because of the climate and because of years of persecution when having a menorah outside was dangerous. But ideally the menorah should be outside, and thus the Gemara relates the following halacha. The order of the Gemara is very interesting. In theory, you would think that the question, what is Chanukah, with the backstory would be first, and then we'll go into how to light the menorah, then we'll go to the order. But it goes into which candles, then how to light the menorah, then where it should go, then interrupts the story, and then goes back to where it should go. The order is kind of interesting, but I'm sure there's lots of commentary on that, but this is the way the Gemara is.
Can you also say that's the mentioned before, where they knew the story already? So they're expecting everyone to know the story, and it's just to more define it.
So yeah, it's probably expecting you to know certain things, and also it depends on how the conversation's evolved, but that too requires explanation. What is it they're expecting us to know, and why is it that it's playing out this way? Anyway, okay, so if you count up from the, there's 3 very wide lines, and then on top of that, count up 3. The first word is Bahalal, Vahida, and then it's Tanan. So Tanan Hassan, we learned over there with respect to the laws of damages, not with respect to the laws of Chanukah, with respect to the laws of damages in general. It says as follows: a spark that comes out from under a hammer. A person's a welder of metal, and as it was in the old day, you had to heat up the metal still is today this way, but I guess they have machines to do it. But essentially, a smith, someone who bends metal, not someone who welds metal. Someone who bends metal, and you heat up the metal very, very hot, and you have a hammer, and you have your gloves to hold it on the other end, and you clank on the metal to get it to the shape you want, and it's very hot, and there's clanking metals, and sparks fly out. That's the nature of it. So the halacha is a spark that comes flying out from under a hammer, and it's gone out, behizik, and damaged someone. It burnt somebody's property, or it burnt someone directly. So chayiv, obviously the person who is hammering, is responsible. He's doing a dangerous activity, not an illegal one, but a dangerous one, and therefore it's incumbent on him to take the necessary precautions to make sure that the flame does not bother damage anybody else, and if it does, he's responsible. However, Gomal, a camel, Shato and Pishton, is carrying flax, which is very flammable. It's a bunch of straw. And this person is pulling his camel filled with flammable straw. And the way he's packed the straw is so overly packed that actually some of the straw made it into this guy's store. That's how big it is. It's like, it's going along the side of the road. It's overflowing a camel full of
wide load.
A very wide load, yeah. Overflowing with what's it called? Straw. And some of the straw ends up in the other guy's, in this guy's property, in his store. And it caught fire from the flame of the guy in the store. The guy's got a candle to keep the store light. There's no electricity, and it catches fire. And then it burns something else down as a result. Someone else's home or whatever it is. So the person who owned the camel, he's responsible because he irresponsibly overloaded his camel. So even though when it came to me doing a dangerous activity, banging on the metal, I'd take precautions. But if I'm living in my home, or my office, and I'm lighting my candles as I ordinarily would, and some other guy irresponsibly overloading his thing and it's dragging through my office, I'm not responsible for the fact that it went on fire. It's his responsibility for irresponsibly overloading his camel. That's the halacha. I guess a modern version of that is, if you have an overloaded truck, you have to have those lights. You have to have the car behind it which says overloaded thing, slow down. Otherwise, that guy would be responsible if I got into an accident because he's driving a big truck that's too big for the road. So he has to take the necessary precautions to make sure that everybody's aware and everybody's right. This is it's standard halacha. If you're doing something dangerous, you take precautions. You're doing something ordinary, not your precaution. Somebody else got to take precautions if they're doing something unordinary. Reasonable. So now because it's a question of reasonability and it's a question of whether I'm doing standard practice. So now what happens? Now the store owner let his menorah outside at the front of his office, which he's supposed to, even though it's not his home, it's his office. But it used to be that people lived in their offices. You owned you had an apartment in the back and your storefront in the front. So the guy who owns that apartment / storefront would light his menorah at the street outside. That's the halacha. So he niya chemlis neder b'chutz. No, I'm sorry. Forget the menorah for a second. Sorry. I'm sorry. If the guy, before we get to the menorah, if the store owner lit his candle not inside of his store, but he put it outside of his store, and then the camel caught fire, chayiv, he's responsible because he should have placed his candle indoors, not outside. Right? If I lit my candle indoors, then I'm exempt because it was his responsibility for overloading his camel to the point that some of his straw is coming into my store. But if I lit it outside, I'm responsible. However, Yehuda says, when it comes to a Chanukah candle, I'm exempt because I'm doing what I'm supposed to. If I have my Chanukah candle outdoors, if it wasn't a Chanukah candle, you shouldn't have had your flame there, and therefore it's your responsibility if the camel goes on fire, or if the produce on the camel goes on fire. But if it's a Chanukah candle, which I'm responsible to put out there, assuming I live there as well, right? So I did this the way I'm supposed to, and it's not my responsibility that somebody else's camel went on fire, that his produce went on fire. Okay, and therefore that's the end of the quote from the text that we just introduced from the laws of damages. So here's an example, by the way.
More like because it's all about reasonable expectations.
Yes,
so
correct.
So the guy walking his camel should realize that it's Hanukkah.
Exactly.
That there's going to be lights outside all these streets.
Exactly.
And that it could burn.
So it's a reasonable expectation. That's the right way of putting it.
He's not going to expect lights to be on the outside.
Correct.
On the inside.
Correct. That's a good way of putting it. Reasonable expectation.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who's going through a Jewish town, you should know that it's Hanukkah now. But ordinarily, you have not to expect that. When someone else has a candle outside, that guy's responsibility. Okay, so this is, by the way, an example of, we just quoted a Mishnah from the laws of damages. Here's an example of the Mishnah mentioning Chanukah in passing, but never telling us the laws of Chanukah. Remember in the introduction, we said that there's no tractate called Chanukah, even though the Mishnah will ordinarily, by the way, mention Chanukah. Here's an example. We're talking about the laws of damages, and it happens to mention Chanukah, but nowhere does it tell you to light the menorah or how to light the menorah. It's interesting. So it acknowledges its existence, but doesn't give you the laws of it. So this is an example of one such acknowledgement that Chanukah exists, from the Mishnah at least. Okay, so now, having quoted that text, Amar Ravina says, Mishum de Rabbi, in the name of Rabbi. This Mishnah implies, from the fact that if my Chanukah candle is outside my store, or outside my house, and the other guy's camel produce went on fire, I'm not responsible. This implies, as we just pointed out, but this is now this is more about the details. Not only am I required to put it outside, which you already knew, but actually the mitzvah is to keep it within 10 handbreadths from the ground. Why is that the implication? Because if I'm allowed to put my menorah higher, then the camel guy driver can say to the owner of the store, you should have put your menorah higher. You're claiming that you're exempt from paying for the damages you caused to my produce because you were doing a mitzvah. Well, you didn't have to put it at that height. You could have put it much higher and it wouldn't have touched me. So you put it lower by your own choice. Following? So this implies, therefore, that the menorah should stay lower. And that's why he's exempt. Clear? Clear? So not only does it tell you where it's placed, as in it should be placed outside. That we already knew from the text we quoted last week. But now we're learning a new detail, that the height of it would be the kind of height that would make a camel's produce go on fire. Because if I'm not required to put it at that height, the camel driver should say, I'm not responsible for knowing you're going to put a flame there. You should have put it much higher, because you could. Don't tell me you're responsible to put the menorah there because it's Chanukah. Put it higher. Clear? Or he can't make that claim, which means that I'm required by law to have the menorah at such a height that would ordinarily catch a flame. Thus, it has to be within 10 tefachim from the ground, which is very low. It's how big is 10 tefachim? 30 inches, 35 inches, something like that. It's not so much. Says the Gemara, no. That's not a conclusive evidence. Why? Because Dilma, perhaps, if the sage is required, you have to put your menorah outside. But because we're worried about you damaging the camel, make sure it goes higher. If we made the guy so crazy, aslam mitzvah, he wouldn't even do it at all. He would say, okay, it's too much, I'm not doing it. So it doesn't mean that it's required to be at that height. It just means we're not going to compel him to put it higher, because otherwise he's going to drop the whole mitzvah. So in other words, it doesn't have to be higher, but it could be higher. Following? Okay, so now let's see the actual heights. Now let's see the actual heights. Now that we know from this mission, there's no conclusive evidence as to how high it has to be, but at least we know it could be higher or it could be lower. At least we know that now. So let's see the actual parameters. Says the Gemara. Last line of the page. Omer of Kana said, Rabbi Nosson, son of Menoimi, expounded and explained the following Mishmei Rabbi Tanachon in the name of Tanachon, top of 21a. 22a, I'm sorry. Ner Chanukah, the light of the Chanukah candle, the menorah, Sheinicha, that was placed. L'mayla michaf amma, higher than 20 amma, psula is invalid. If it's higher than 20 ammas, which is 20 cubits, it's roughly 40 feet. No, sorry, it's 32 feet. At least by the minimum standard of what an amma is. Depending on how big an amma is. Depends how big an amma is. But if I'm not mistaken, the actual size is 32. And I know this because you can check up I think it's even in the Guinness Book of World Record, the tallest menorah is in Manhattan and it's 32 feet high. Pretty short. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but somewhere around that ballpark. So depending on how big the amma is, it's somewhere in that ballpark.
What if someone just beats the record, even if it's not kosher?
So maybe it's not a kosher menorah. Maybe he can make it into the Guinness Book, but he couldn't make it into the Guinness Book of Halacha.
Yes, that's what I hear.
Anyway, the halacha is good. Anyway, so why is it that you can't have the menorah higher than that? Why not? Make it as high as you want. So the Gemara tells us, Kisukah kamavoy. It's because it's the same law as the sukkah, whose schach cannot be higher than 20 amos from the ground. And a mavoy is not a courtyard, but like an alleyway that shares, in which there are multiple entrances. So it's a walled alleyway. So it's an alleyway that has full walls going through, and there are doors that go to different courtyards. So this area, this alleyway, is technically not a public arena, because a public arena by halacha for the laws of Shabbos has to be a certain width and has to have a certain amount of traffic going every day, and it has to have certain openings. It's a very detailed and complex set of laws, but this alleyway is not technically a public road on Shabbos, but it's not a private one either. And therefore, because it's not a private one either, Shlomo HaMelech instituted that one should not carry in that area because it's a shared space, even though it's not technically a public space. Remember, public space doesn't mean, like what we say, Cleve Road being public. Cleve Road is not a public road by halachic standards, because it doesn't have enough traffic. In Hebrew, Carmelit. Well, Carmelit's a bit different. Mavoy. Mem vet vav yud. Mavoy. An alleyway. So it's a shared space. It's a good way of putting it. It's a shared space, not a public space, not a legally defined public space. That's right. The key word of mavoy means, that's right. So it's all the people who live there share that space to get into their homes. So to get from their homes to the public space. So the halacha is, based on Shlomo HaMelech's institution, is that you have to make a marker point that's going to indicate to you, here's where the mavoy ends. And once you make those marker points, and there are other things they do to share their space, they can carry within it. Now, because you have to make a marker space indicating to people walking, here's where the mavoy ends and here's where public space begins, that mavoy, that marker space, has to be within 20 cubits, 20 amas. So we see a cross beam. That's the marker. Well, it could in theory be other things. Has to have two things on the side. Sorry? So it's very complicated. So laws, but how big the mavoi is, what is, it's either two poles on one side, or it's a cross beam, or it's a both, or it's one. It's very complicated laws. But the point is, it has to be a marker. And the marker indicating to you where it ends. So you have three things that all have to be within 20 cubits. The marker indicating where the end of the mavoi is, the sukkah, and now we're finding out the menorah also. What do they all three share in common? The person walking on the street has to be able to see it. That's what they all share in common. If you're sitting in the sukkah, the halacha is you have to be able to, without looking up like that, be able to just, in your peripheral vision, you should see the schach. Why is that? Because the Torah says, as part of the mitzvah, you're sitting in the sukkah so that you should know that you sat in huts / clouds of glory when you traveled in the desert. So you have to be aware of the schach. And thus it can't have to be within 20 amos that your eye sees it at an easy glance. Likewise with the mavoi, the whole point is for it to be a marker to tell you where the mavoi ends. If it's way high up and you don't see it, what's the point? It's got to be within 20 amos. That your eyes catch it when you're walking down the alleyway. And the same thing's true of the menorah. The whole point is to publicize the miracle for people on the street. So people on the street have to be able to naturally see it when they're walking, and therefore it has to be within 20 amos. So now we have the halacha. It's got to be under 20 amos. It's very high. It's about, to mention that it's somewhere between 30 and 40 feet, depending on how big an amma is. If I'm not mistaken, they're going with the more strict view, it's 32 feet, if I'm not mistaken. But the halacha is also, it has to be higher than 3 tefachim. It should be above 3 tefachim from the ground. And the Chabad custom is, if you try, that it should be between 3 and 10 tefachim. So it's quite low. Sorry?
Getting back to the Carmel.
Yeah.
Is actually a Carmel?
Cleave? Yeah.
I thought the Carmelite started at somebody's property and they fence it off.
That's what you have to do in a carmelit to be able to carry. To be able to carry in a carmelit, you have to fence it off and share food. It's very complicated, which is why some people don't bother using an Eiruv. No, what does the Eiruv do? The Eiruv doesn't take a public domain and make it private. You can't. An Eiruv takes a carmelit and makes it private. Right? So this Eiruv, this mavoi, that marker takes that shared space and makes it a private space, that allowing them to carry in it. Same thing with a carmelit and same thing with a chutzner. There's different types of shared spaces that you can turn into a private space by fencing it off in a certain way and sharing food. It's complicated. So because of the complications around it, especially when you come to a city, because within a city you have carmelites, say Cleve Road, that's open to a public road to carry. Carry is a public road because it's a highway which goes from city to city. So even if it didn't have 600,000 people, it's still, I think, would still qualify as a public space. There are 3 qualifications. Halachas are very complicated. Just a very quick overview. There are 3 types of ways of classifying a public space. A, the amount of people that are there. B, if it's an open market space. And C, if it is a highway that goes from one city to the next. I'm quite sure that the carry would qualify as 2 out of the 3. It goes from city to city. That's what it is. The 15 takes you from one city to the other. And also, I imagine the 600,000 people will drive through every day, on an average day. That's my guess. And certainly wide enough. It certainly has 16 amos that are required. Now, the complication becomes when you have a lot of mavoi, which is one type of shared space, but a carmelit that's open to a public space. And how do you qualify closing off a carmelit from an open space? And whether or not the string actually works or not.
That's why you can't cross. You can't cross the carry.
It's correct, which is why the Eiruv, if you look at the map, doesn't let you cross every part of the carry. No. Only one part of the carry let it cross in the Eiruv. Through Van Horn.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's not.
Oh no, sorry, by Buret or by Kutz in the Grove. By Buret. And that's because of that. So you have to find a passageway that's narrow enough to make these strings to allow you to cut off the fact that it's no longer a thing. It's very complicated, which is why many would just ignore it all entirely. Sorry? It's not just the best place. You have to look at the map online.
No, it's the best place in the city because every other place they cross the carry. The street, this is only the narrow place.
You have to look at the map online. It tells you which street you let it cross.
There's only Barat.
Yeah? Barat's the only one that's open between 2 sides? Yeah. Anyway, online you can find a map.
Yeah.
Sorry? So because of all these complications, and especially since the Alter Rebbe is machmir in a number of areas, the Alter Rebbe is more strict in a number of areas. For example, the distances between the poles, the Alter Rebbe is machmir on. And other such problems that the Alter Rebbe is more concerned with. So many, especially Chabadniks, would not rely on any Eiruv, even though it's fully kosher by by many standards. And lastly, this is something that's very interesting. There's a letter. I mean, I don't know why it's published, because if you read, when you'll hear the content of the letter, you'll see it's supposed to not be published. But the reality is, it is published. But and because it's published, I'll share it with you. It's an interesting letter. So the Rabbanim in Manhattan wrote to the Rebbe asking if they should make an Eiruv in Manhattan. And the Rebbe says, yes, but don't tell anybody. Why? Yes, because once you put an Eiruv, let's take the most lenient view. Let's just say you made an Eiruv by the most lenient view, right? Then, at least in accordance to that view, all the thousands or millions of Jews, I don't mean Jews live in Manhattan, hundreds of thousands of Jews who don't know about Shabbos and are carrying on Shabbos will have been saved from violating Shabbos thanks to the fact that there's an Eiruv there without them even knowing. So put it up, even if it's only going to be the most lenient view. But don't publicize it, because then you'll have people who would ordinarily follow the more strict view now become more lenient and become more lax in the Shabbos observance because you told them there's an Eiruv. So put it up, but don't tell anybody. This is what everyone wrote to Manhattan. Sorry? In other words, and this is really the guiding force of the Chabadnik. Even if in theory the Eiruv did match up to all the Alter Rebbe's stringencies, the Lubavitcher still wouldn't use the Eiruv, because the Rebbe didn't want people to get comfortable with the notion that carrying is not part of Shabbos. And I know this. I once spoke to somebody who became more religious, and they're spending Shabbos in Miami, right? And they had a family discussion. They decided that they keep Shabbos minus the issue of carrying. Why? Because they got so comfortable with the notion of carrying on Shabbos in Montreal. So when they began to observe Shabbos, it didn't include not carrying. So the notion of enjoying Shabbos without carrying was out of their experience. And when they came to a place where there was no Eiruv, wherever they happened to be, there's no Eiruv, so they decided, we carry on Shabbos because that's the way we observe Shabbos. So psychologically, it makes you think of Shabbos as a time when you're allowed to carry. And that's something they didn't want. And thus, even if all the Eiruv was perfectly fine, a good Chabadnik would not use so the Crown Heights is an Eiruv, and many use it, but most don't, most do not. That Eiruv actually is more machmir than the Manhattan one. It actually follows most of the Alter Rebbe's opinion. My street, David Lewis. I'm not sure. I think it's part of it. Look at the map. I really don't know. I don't use it anyway, but it is.
It is for sure, because for sure Jay and stuff like.
I'm sure. I don't know. Look at the map on Manhattan. Look at the map.
I looked at the map of Manhattan.
Where do you find this map?
I think it's on the Vadair's website.
You can find it online.
No. The Vadair. Like the.
There's the number to call, and they'll tell you.
I think you could sign up for alert. They'll tell you on Friday if it's operating or not. Because somebody has to go around every Friday to check it.
They used to get that bulletin.
Oh, yeah?
They used to post it on every Friday, the condition of the area. Rabbi Woodman is very
I think he's part of it, right? He's part of the Rav Machshir, right?
He's very into checking the area about and everything.
I think he carries responsibility for it, doesn't he?
I don't.
Or he's on the board that does.
I don't know if he still does, but he definitely did. Yeah.
He definitely did, and maybe I think he's on the board. I think he's on the board of directors that oversee it. No.
Yeah. So
anyway, it's interesting. You go to the Chabad website and it has it there, but there's a disclaimer saying, it's only according to certain views or whatever. Have a look at the website. It's interesting. Okay, wonderful day, everybody. A happy Chanukah, and we'll continue God willing tomorrow.